Hello, everyone. Just give us a minute. We're going to let everyone into the room, ensure everyone can make it in before we get going. All right, would you like to get started, Chandra?
Thank you, Amadeus, and thank you so much, everyone, for being with us tonight. I'm Chandra Pasma, the MPP for Ottawa West Nepean and the official opposition Shadow Minister for Education. And we are having a conversation tonight about the effects of the Doug Ford government's decisions on parents, workers, and communities as they try to shut our voices out of schools and take away the democratically elected supports that parents depend on. But I want to begin our conversation with a land acknowledgement, because although we are meeting virtually, we still ask that each participant take time to recognize the traditional and treaty territory you are on. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and a way of honoring the Indigenous people who have been living on and caring for these lands since time immemorial. As New Democrats, we understand how important it is to acknowledge the long-standing and painful history that has brought us to reside on the land, and we must continue to seek to understand our place within that history as partners and allies of all Indigenous people. And as we're beginning this conversation on Bill 33, I also want to acknowledge that Bill 33 has negative impacts in the process of seeking reconciliation, particularly with the safety and security of Indigenous students in our schools from kindergarten to grade 12, and in the capacity for universities and colleges to pursue reconciliation as they admit students to post-secondary programs. I'm going to start with an overview of Bill 33 and what the stakes are for parents and students and workers and trustees and communities in Ontario. And then I'm going to turn it over to a panel of expert voices from across the country that we've assembled, who are going to provide some perspective on what has taken place in other provinces, particularly Nova Scotia and Quebec, where governments have succeeded in taking away the democratically elected voices of parents and communities. But we're also going to end with a note of hope, because we have someone who is prepared to speak to the experience in Manitoba, where they successfully fought off an attempt by a conservative government to take away the democratic rights of students, parents, and communities. So if you're not familiar with Bill 33, it is a piece of legislation that was tabled by the Ford government earlier this year in May that has a number of components. So we're going to be focusing specifically on one, but there are many different parts of this bill that have a serious and detrimental impact on our students from kindergarten through PhD programs. But what this bill does is it allows the Minister of Education to take over a school board at any time for any reason that he wants. And when the Minister of Education takes over a school board, he is able to shunt aside the democratically elected trustees who represent the voices of parents, who make decisions based on consultation and who are accountable to parents, and replace them with somebody that the Minister of Education has personally handpicked, who is accountable to nobody but the Minister of Education, and who has the capacity to make decisions about everything regarding schools, from what programs are offered, what schools they are offered at, what schools students may attend, hiring and where resources are allocated, where new schools are located, and what schools or public properties may be sold off by the school board. So we are talking about literally every decision regarding local schools can be made by this one person without any consultation or any form of accountability to the community. And we're already seeing in Ontario a glimpse of what the future would look like under Bill 33 in the 5 boards that the minister has already put under supervision, where decisions are being made in the dark. These supervisors are not holding public forums, or where they are attending public committee meetings, there are bans on those meetings being recorded and shared. They are not sharing the criteria on which they are making decisions. They are not always sharing information that they have made a decision. They're not providing straight answers where they are giving information about decisions that they've taken. And in the case of one supervisor, when he was being challenged on those decisions, he literally said he does not have to answer to anybody. So there is no way for parents to hold supervisors accountable for the decisions that they're making, even though we can already see their decisions begin to harm some of our most vulnerable students, particularly with their actions around special education. So this is what we can already see in Ontario. But as I said, there are other provinces, Nova Scotia and Quebec, where government succeeded in taking away the democratically elected trustees who support families and who are required to consult and listen to workers, students, families, and communities, and are accountable to them through elections. And so we're going to hear more tonight about what the impact of the loss of those democratically elected trustees has been for families, for workers, and communities. And so to begin this conversation, I'm going to invite Dr. Sachin Maharaj to share about his research into these two provinces. And Dr. Maharaj is an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. His research explores school board governance, teacher unions, equity in school choice, and student cell phone use policies. Widely published in academic journals, he also contributes regularly to the Toronto Star and appears in media outlets such as CBC, CTV, and TVO. Over to you, Sachin.
Thank you, Chandra. So just to begin, I think it's important to reflect on why we have elected school boards in the first place, because they're this really unusual form of local governance that doesn't really exist in other sectors. But there's something that we've had in Canada, prior to Confederation. And so why were they created? Why have they persisted through time? And there's really two reasons. The first is that schools were thought to be special, and special in the sense of being really intimately connected to local communities. And so if you think of neighborhoods across the province, schools are often a focal point of the neighborhood, a hub, a place where people come together. And so it was thought that schools are intimately connected to communities, so communities should have input in the way schools function. And then it was thought that in the process of communities coming together to decide what happens in schools, that would actually increase the ties between different members of the community, increase the bonds, the social capital. And we even see that if any of you are connected into the work of schools, like I see that when I go to my local school, whether it's to volunteer or that's where a lot of our elections are held. That's where you go to vote. People come together, or people come to watch sports, or even after the school day, people come to do other extracurricular activities. It's really a place where you get to meet and connect with people in your local communities. But then the second reason we have it is because it was thought that schooling really needs to be insulated from regular partisan politics. And this is part of the reason we have elected school board members that don't really run under the banners of political parties. And so, in the absence of elected school boards, we really lose both of those things. Schools will become more partisan as a result in terms of the way they function, more directly controlled by the provincial government that happens to be in power. And two, it reduces the ability of communities to have a local voice and the ability of communities to really come together to make decisions about the education of our children. And that's what my research has really revealed. So research I've just recently completed in Nova Scotia looked into what some of the changes were that people noticed after school boards were eliminated there in 2018. And so we did a survey of over 1,000 Nova Scotians and also interviewed various insiders, both in the Department of Education, previous school board chairs, people on parent councils, teacher union members, among many others. And essentially what we found was that the impacts were most closely felt by those that had the strongest connections to schools. So people with parents in schools, members of school advisory councils, people who would volunteer in schools. They were the ones that noticed the most dramatic changes. And also those that experienced the most marginalization in schools. Because in the absence of an elected school board, what people report is that essentially there's nowhere to turn to. That was a quote that one participant shared. Schools become much more bureaucratic. People are just kind of given the runaround when they have concerns, and concerns aren't really addressed. And so as a result, things become much less transparent. And, one parent said basically now it feels like we're just dealing with, quote, faceless corporations. And so the kind of humane nature that schools might previously have had, that is all gone. But that's not all to say that with elected school boards, everything is perfect. I just came from an event in Toronto where we were talking about some of these issues, and I was speaking to community members, parents, and they said, we weren't always happy with our elected school board or elected school board trustees, but now that they're gone, we literally have nowhere to turn to to raise our concerns. And so I think that's really what's at stake here is that if we continue down this trend and if school boards are eliminated here in Ontario, things are going to become much more bureaucratic, much less transparent, and there'll be much less ability for communities to come together, both to have their voice heard in the way schools are run, and much less ability for communities to make important social bonds with each other.
Thank you very much, Sachin. So now to hear more directly about what is happening in Nova Scotia, I'm going to turn it over to Paul Wozni. Paul is the member of the Legislative Assembly for Sackville-Cobequid, recently elected, and before that, Paul served as the Nova Scotia Teachers Union president. Paul was president both before and after school boards were abolished in Nova Scotia, and Paul is also a teacher and parent. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Chandra. Yeah, so thank you to Sachin for kind of that recap of the research that he led here in Nova Scotia. Um, I've been asked to talk about sort of the impact of the removal of democratically elected Anglophone school boards in Nova Scotia, the impact on communities, teachers, and local decision making. So I first want to speak to communities. Um, Nova Scotia's school boards, structurally, before they were removed, every school board had designated seats for a representative of community members who identified as African, Nova Scotian, or Black. Nova Scotia is unique in Canada. It's home to 52 historically Black communities. There are 450 years of Black history in Nova Scotia. We're home to the oldest Indigenous Black communities in the country. And so that structural representation was sort of a hallmark of our school boards. And alongside of that, we also had a designated seat on each Anglophone school board for people who identified as Mi'kmaq or Indigenous. When these Anglophone school boards were eradicated, that community voice was lost. The other thing I would say is, school board governance is the one level of electoral politics in the country where we've managed to achieve gender parity or better. And so when we look, if you go up the road to municipal politics, one tier, and then you get to provincial politics, gender parity falls off substantially as you go up, sort of in the hierarchy of politics. So that's been lost in Nova Scotia. Lots of really powerful women in Nova Scotia political history have really found their footing in school board politics, and now that's an opportunity that's lost to them. So there's one Francophone school board in Nova Scotia that maintains its elected board of trustees. It's called the Conseil scolaire acadien provincial. And so it operates Francophone schools from one end of the province to the other. So it's not a local school board in the same way that other school boards kind of have schools in a geographic catchment. But I agree with Sachin that the people that feel the loss of school boards most acutely are the people that historically have been left out of decision making and excluded and come from a place of less privilege because of systemic racism and prejudice. So African Nova Scotians and Indigenous Nova Scotians in particular, but now also women and people who are non-binary and genderqueer. So, those voices are finding it hard to be heard in public education. When it comes to impact on teachers, I would say teachers are left bearing the price tag. When there's nobody to talk to about what you're frustrated with, angry parents unload on school staff. They attack the teacher, they attack the teaching assistant, they attack the caring adult that they probably have a very good relationship with and think very well of. But because you're the only person available, you bear the brunt of people sort of unloading on you. And that's unfair because teachers had nothing to do with this decision. They didn't support it. And yet, that sort of adds to the emotional and personal labor that the teachers do every single day. And they're already overloaded and burnt out in Nova Scotia that the way are right across the country. And last, I would say local decision making. The current Conservative government was elected in 2021. They were just reelected in 2024. But in 2021, when they won their first majority term, they ran on a platform to restore democratically elected school boards, which they flip-flopped on. And ultimately, they said, well, we have these new things called school advisory councils, and we're going to do everything possible to enhance these. And that's how local voice is gonna feature in local school decision making. What's missing in the big picture, though, is that that's fine when you have a school where parents and kids can walk to school and they can walk to the school after school to have a meeting. In consolidated rural schools where you drop a pin in the map and you bus from an hour around the community, there are geographic and economic barriers. Parents can't leave their kids at home for 4 hours to drive an hour round trip to a couple-hour meeting and participate, or they have to miss a shift and they can't do that. So we have plenty. There's over 330 public schools in Nova Scotia, and dozens of them have no functioning SAC because the model is not sustainable, particularly in rural Nova Scotia. And of course, we appreciate that rural schools are unique in terms of, I would argue that they're at times they matter more in rural communities than perhaps they do in more concentrated population areas like suburbs and urban areas, where there are other amenities and other vehicles to be heard and participate. And schools take on an amplified significance in those communities. So, I think I would, the last thing I would say is I agree with Sachin. I'm not going to spill Jesse Legale. He's going to speak next from Nova Scotia. I'm not going to spill his parent tea. But he's going to speak to an example of how parents facing significant delays to a school build, getting answers on that question, unless you find a champion in the legislature to put a question to a minister in question period or exercise high level political privilege, parents are finding it very difficult to get answers on any decisions that have impact for the learners. So whether that's school discipline, whether that's a failure of inclusive education supports. I have a constituent that contacted me recently. A local school enacted very rigid, you got a section of the playground you had to play on, and they didn't explain to parents why this was taken. So there may have been good reasons why it's in the best interest of kids, but the parents can't get any answers from the principal. And so now it falls to me as an MLA to get an answer to a very simple, reasonable question. And it's, the idea of being a faceless corporation. I would agree. A lot of parents are discovering when they need an answer, unless you have a political champion, you're not going to get one. So, hopefully Ontario parents rise up and hold fast to the avenues that they have for voice and participation, because once they're lost, the political will to put them back in wanes very quickly.
Thank you very much, Paul. And that's a perfect segue to Jesse Legele, who is a parent who is joining us tonight from Halifax to talk about his personal experience about what it's like to have lost your democratically elected trustee. Jesse?
Hey, thanks for having me. Yeah, I would echo both what Sachin and Paul said in numerous ways. So the personal story that I'll relate is that about 5 years ago, the school that our kids were going to would needed to be rebuilt. And 6 years later, it's not built. And that process of trying to understand why, how it happened has been one that's been deeply frustrating, and I think has illuminated to a lot of parents the absolute lack of access to power that you have The school boards are a political entity, a body where parents can affect power. We don't have that anymore here in Nova Scotia. I call Public Works, we call the Halifax Regional Board of Education, we call our MLAs, we call the Conservative government because they're the governing party at the moment, and it's nothing. Everyone points to everyone else. There's zero accountability, and nobody has any interest in solving this issue. We don't have, in our neighborhood where the school is being built, it's not a conservative stronghold, so there's nobody they're not gonna put any energy into it. And as to what Sachin had said previously, this is supposed to be something that's removed from party politics, and it becomes incredibly adhered to party politics. So the parents are also realizing that when you're engaged in something, this is to what Paul said, when you're actively engaged with school boards, it might seem frustrating. They're full of problems. Everything is. That's what democracy is. It's solving those problems. But when you remove them and people lose the relationship to the schools and to the system where they see themselves as participants, we're now just spectators. And when you lose that participatory kind of feeling towards it, it leads to entropy. Parents don't know how to organize. Parents are all working 2 jobs, don't have enough money, they don't have the time. So they're unable to affect change, and it leaves it to a few parents who either financially or just personality-wise can. But then, as I previously said, you knock on every door and nobody cares. And it can just be shoveled off into the halls of a Kafkaesque bureaucracy where you hear papers shuffling, but no one's going to do anything. And when they put forward the idea of the SAC, the Student Advisory Councils, well, those are volunteer positions, they're not paid, and nobody has to listen to them in any way, shape, or form. The SACs are primarily populated by people who have enough time and income to do that, and they tend to, and this isn't necessarily criticism, it's just a fact, be on the side, or at least have far more understanding of the people in power who are legislating the changes than that the parents do. And so it is not an effective avenue for change. And I think that what we're realizing is that the school boards are a place where direct democracy is practiced. It's where you cut your teeth, as to what Paul said, for both people who want to be politicians, but also for people in a community where you learn how these things work, where you engage in them, where you go to town meetings, and you have to practice that sort of thing. And it's one of the few places where you can practice it on a small level. And when that's gone, we're finding ourselves just watching and going, wow, it's terrible. All these things that are happening to our schools and our kids, and people are getting angrier and angrier. And as to what Paul said, they are going to the schools and they are getting mad at the teachers. The teachers can't do anything. The principal's scared to talk to anyone. There's a lot of politics going on behind the scenes that the parents don't understand because there's no one to explain it to them. And you're left in a situation where you're watching your kids go through a system where you can't affect any change. You know, the people who are in positions of power in that system don't have their best interest. That's obviously clear. And aren't interested in giving your power back. And what I'd say to the people in Ontario listening right now is, you know, as we all know, power doesn't relinquish power. If you lose that school board, I'm doubtful any political party will give it back once it's gone, because it's an avenue where we can actually say on a non-party based platform, hey, this is what we want, and be loud and noisy and make a difference. And no governing party wants that. So you lose it at your own risk, and we are an example of how that is gone, and it's not great. Yeah, that's it. That would be my little wrap up.
Thank you so much, Jesse. You've certainly given us a warning of what our future could be like in Ontario, and I don't think that's a future that any parent, worker, or community member wants to see. So thank you for sharing your experience with us. Unfortunately, Nova Scotia is not the only province that is facing this scenario. Quebec has also taken away the democratically elected trustees. Now, I think Heidi will also tell you that there are some court battles taking place around this. So right now it's not for every school, but they are already seeing the impact of this in Quebec as well. So to share more about this situation with us, we have Heidi Yetman, who is the president of the Quebec Provincial Association of Teachers, representing 8,000 teachers in the province of Quebec. And from 2023 to 2025, Heidi was president of the Canadian Teachers Federation, following 2 successful terms as vice president. So welcome, Heidi.
Forgot to unmute. Thanks very much for having me. Thanks, Chandra. Yes, Quebec. Oh my goodness. So first, I want to make it really, really clear that this would be a total loss of democracy at a time when democracy is pretty fragile, a loss of local democracy, a loss of accountability, and a loss of community voices. So in Quebec, in February of 2020, there was a bill that passed that removed elected officials. In Quebec, we call them commissioners, but that would be like your trustees. And replaced them with a board of directors. And the board of directors is just composed of volunteer people, unpaid, as Jesse was saying. And they are under a code of ethics. And this is what's really problematic. The code of ethics basically says that there must be proof of loyalty to the service centers. School boards in the French sector were transformed into service centers. And luckily, the English school boards remain, so we still have elected commissioners. But the code of ethics also prohibits anybody on a board of directors to comment on decisions that are being made. So it's like having a gag order basically on school service centers. So it's increased centralization. It's handed more power to the Minister of Education, and director generals of these service centers are hired and fired by the Minister of Education and therefore cannot challenge the government. So they are silent. And I really want to highlight something that's happened recently in Quebec. In June, the government announced $570 million in cuts to education. And again, service centers and those board of directors in the service centers could say nothing. Luckily, the English sector is there, and we still have our commissioners, and they were able to come out and speak against the cuts and also joined forces with principals and parents and unions. And we fought very hard in June, and the government had to turn around and reinvest $510 million. Those $510 million, though, had strict conditions, very strict conditions. So our school boards are bringing the government to court, whereas service centers are sitting silently, not saying a word about what is happening in education. And these cuts are hurting students in the classrooms, services to students in the classrooms, and they cannot say a word. As a matter of fact, very recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the service centers, so the director generals who are silenced, actually wrote a letter to the Minister of Education telling the Minister of Education that things were not going well and that the funds that were reinvested weren't enough. Publicly, Premier Legault came out and said, well, I guess there will be some directors that will be fired. So a gag order on those service centers. And I think this is a really huge problem when you can't have a voice out there, when you can't go up against the government to say, hey, whoa, stop, this isn't working. And I also believe this is a really big distraction. It's just it's taking away what really is happening in education. So I know that in Ontario there was a trustee that maybe have spent a little bit too much money, and so he's the example that everybody's using. But trustees are really important. They represent the community. They're people that you can go and talk to. And they can speak up against a government decision. They can go out publicly and speak. Our commissioners were always doing that. We're speaking publicly. Now we have nobody to speak publicly against a government that is doing terrible things to education. But what I was going to say is this is a distraction. What we really need to do is invest in education. And I know that in Ontario, there's been cuts. What I read was 6.3 billion cuts in education since 2018. So this is distracting from what really is the problem in education in Ontario, and that is budget cuts. I love a quote by Noam Chomsky that says the standard technique of privatization is to defund, make sure that things aren't working, and then people get angry and hand it over to the private sector. Ontario is one of the only places besides the East that doesn't subsidize private schools, and I have a fear that that might be coming. So this does affect students. So that's really important to remember. And it affects teachers, it affects community, and it affects parents and society in general. So it's not a great thing. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Heidi. We appreciate it. So, as you can hear from these stories from Nova Scotia and Quebec, losing our democratically elected trustees would be catastrophic for students, for parents, for families, for communities, and for workers. We would lose our right to have a say in the decisions that are made concerning our local schools, whether it's what resources our kids have access to, how many caring adults they have around them to support them, how our schools are used as community hubs, where our schools are located. These are all incredibly essential local decisions in which local communities should have a say, and the people making these decisions should be accountable to us. But I don't want you to leave this feeling hopeless and depressed, because we have a chance to fight this off here. And so our next speaker is going to bring us the optimism of a victory that happened in Manitoba to inspire us for the work that lies ahead with us here in Ontario. And our next speaker is Evan Crosney. Evan is a lifelong Manitoban and a member of the Board of Trustees in the Seven Oaks School Division. He was first elected to the board in 2022 and became the first Gen Z elected to public office in Winnipeg. Evan's work in the school division has prioritized keeping class sizes small, ensuring school board dollars stay invested in the classroom, and working to break down barriers so that all students have equitable access to the opportunities and resources they need to succeed, no matter where they come from or their family's income. Evan makes his home in North Winnipeg, where he is an active member of the West Kildonan and Garden City community, and he works as the provincial secretary of the Manitoba NDP. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. I hope that tonight I can bring a little bit of optimism here in sunny Manitoba, where, of course, we have a great NDP government that's doing a lot of great work investing in education and making sure schools do have those resources that we need. But it wasn't that long ago, of course, here in Manitoba that we were talking about some pretty drastic and, dare I say, draconian reforms that would have eliminated local school boards and local decision-making in Manitoba. So what we were dealing with, it was back in 2021 that this piece of legislation by the previous PC government was announced. It was called the Education Modernization Act, but colloquially it kind of became known as Bill 64, since that was the bill that it was in the session back then. And it was pretty darn quick that Bill 64 in Manitoba became a bit of a lightning rod for being a controversial piece of legislation. And what's interesting about Bill 64 is the consultant who actually did a lot of the work around it, I believe her name was Avis Glaze, was actually the same consultant that had pushed through Nova Scotia's reforms a number of years prior. So as soon as this review started to happen, people in Manitoba, their spidey senses started to tingle. And people thought, okay, well, we saw what happened in Nova Scotia. We've heard about all of these terrible things that have happened. What could potentially happen in Manitoba? And sure enough, the recommendations and the legislation that was put forward would have eliminated public English school boards in Manitoba, would have brought in something very similar to what's happening in Nova Scotia. I think the main difference is instead of school advisory councils, they called them school community councils in Manitoba. Gee, that's so different. But of course, it's the same thing. And it would have caused a lot of the same problems. So people in Manitoba were very concerned. We looked at this legislation, we identified a number of problems with it. And what was interesting is the public outrage around this bill cut across the political spectrum. I think this is what's interesting about the story in Manitoba is this piece of legislation was held over by the NDP opposition at the time, and it gave folks the summer to kind of look at this bill and scrutinize it in more details. And the opposition was across the spectrum. There were school boards in every corner of the province, of course, opposing it. There were MLAs, of course, from the NDP who were opposing it. There were municipalities who were opposing it. The city of Winnipeg actually passed a motion formally opposing this, which came from councillors across the spectrum. Various municipalities across Manitoba opposed it, and it really started building these, you could call them unlikely coalitions of different concerned community stakeholders, all of whom had a vested interest in making sure that this Bill 64 did not pass. And of course, Bill 64, the Conservatives who were in government at the time, they said all these nice things about it's about modernization and accountability. But the reality is this would have simply centralized all of the political power into the office of the Minister of Education, taken away all local decision making, and impeding on parents, educators, and students' abilities to get the local accountability and answers that they need out of their trustees. As a local trustee in the Seven Oaks School Division, I hear from parents all the time about things like, concerns they might have in the school, busing and transportation. All of a sudden, instead of being able to come to a locally elected and locally accountable decision maker, parents would have had to go to, either volunteer councils, which are advisory and don't actually have any decision-making ability, or go directly to the minister. And that's really where there was a lot of concern around that removal of decision-making power in the local community that folks were concerned about. So why were we successful in defeating this? Well, because of that broad spectrum of opposition to the bill and organizing across the political spectrum and from various different groups. We had our teachers union who was opposed to it. We had the School Boards Association. There were lawn signs all over the province popping up. I pulled one of my camera is blurred right now, but we made these signs that said "Fight Bill 64." You might not be able to see them, but we had these signs. There were thousands of them popping up all over the province. The signs were in different languages, and the opposition was clear from so many different sources. And eventually, that political pressure on the government worked. And I think it was by fall of 2021, when this legislation was supposed to come back into the legislature, it had become an extreme political liabilities for the PCs. It had even gotten to the point where the former PC premier was resigning, and things were getting real bad from them. And it was that kind of snowballing of political pressure from all of these different people across coalitions that resulted in this. So what can Ontario learn from our fight in defeating Bill 64? I think it comes back to starting early, to making sure that everybody in the province understands what the potential repercussions of this could be, and building coalitions with other groups, with groups of parents, with the teachers union, across municipalities, and making sure that folks in the province understand what this legislation would mean for them. Based on what I understand, Bill 33 in Ontario is essentially Bill 64 2.0 from what's in Manitoba. And I think that what happened in our province is both a warning for the PCs that they should be worried about the potential opposition for this bill, but also a lesson that folks who are opposed to Bill 33 in Ontario can learn. When you come together and build coalitions with different partners, you can defeat legislation like this and you can make change. So I hope that we're a bit of a beacon of hope for you guys, and some of what we were successful with here will work over to the east as well.
Thank you so much, Evan. You've definitely given us the inspiration and the hope that we need, but also laid out the work that lies ahead of us. And, step one is that we defeat this bill. Step two is that we elect an NDP government that will actually invest in our schools and make sure our kids have the resources that they need. But Evan has laid out very clearly what work lies ahead of us in the coming weeks, which is that we need to speak to as many people as we possibly can across Ontario so that they understand that this legislation exists, the threat that it poses to their children, to their communities, to democracy and their right to have a say, and that we not only educate them, but we engage them. We let them know what they can do with their anger about this bill that will put pressure on Doug Ford and Paul Calandra to withdraw this bill. So the Ontario NDP has prepared a toolkit, and Amadeus is going to put the link in the chat, but it's ontariondp.ca/bill33, and we have many different resources there that you can use to engage with people in your local community, whether that is parents at your children's school, whether that is neighbors, whether that is at a community event, or whether that is going out and door knocking. And I can tell you I've done all of those things, and had an incredible response from parents in Ottawa, West Nepean, because when they understand the stakes, they are outraged that the government would attack their rights this way. But our job is to make sure that everybody understands what's happening and what the stakes are. So in our toolkit, we have a flyer that provides a brief explanation of different components of Bill 33. So we have one specifically on this aspect of democratically elected trustees and the lack of the loss of democratic voice. We have one that's specifically about the issue of police officers in schools, which also tramples on the rights of communities to have a say, because communities have been very clear that they don't want them. And there's also a flyer that is specifically about the impact on Franco-Ontarians who have a constitutionally protected right to manage their own education system. So these flyers are a single page that you can hand out that quickly explains the issue to people, but also directs them to our email campaign, where they can click a link or scan a QR code and send an email directly to the Premier and to Paul Calandra asking them to withdraw this bill. There's also a downloadable petition at that page. I was able to stand yesterday in the legislature and table dozens of petitions that were signed by people in Ottawa, and I'm already starting to receive petitions from people in other parts of the province that I will be standing up and tabling in the days to come to highlight to the government how many people in Ontario oppose this bill. Other ways that you can get involved are to work with people in your local community, whether you're a parent, a trustee, a teacher, just a concerned community member. You can reach out to others in your community who share this concern to request a meeting with your local MPP, especially if your MPP is Conservative, to hold a public event or a rally or protest so that the Conservatives, particularly local Conservative MPPs, are feeling the pressure and understanding what the risks are for them electorally if they continue with this bill, so that the government understands there will be consequences for them if they proceed with this attack on democratic rights and if they continue this harmful attack on our children's education. So again, those resources are found at ontariondp.ca/bill33. So we really need everyone to get involved in this campaign and all hands on deck for this work. But now we're going to have a time to answer particular questions about what we've learned tonight. Amadeus is going to be moderating this session for us. He's been keeping an eye on the chat. If you haven't put a question in there yet, please feel free to do so. That's where we'll be taking our questions. Feel free to say it's directed at a single speaker if you'd like, or a general question, and we'll make sure that those who have experience in the area you're asking about have an opportunity to answer that question. So Amadeus, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Chandra. And yes, I put the link in the chat. It's ontariondp.ca/bill33, where you can find all those resources. In a couple clicks, you can send all those emails. You can download our flyers, all our campaign toolkits. So please take a look at that. And Myron asked in the chat whether I can send the toolkit by email. We will be sending all those files and links to everyone who RSVP'd as well. So you'll keep an eye on our emails, and we'll send those out shortly. Please put your questions in the chat, but I already have a few that came while people were speaking, so I'm going to flag those now and we can get going. One is from Mary McMillan that asks, I think, yeah, this could be to several of you, asks that given the removal of school boards there, how was union bargaining changed in Nova Scotia? So were there any noticeable impacts on education workers' union bargaining after the removal of school boards?
I'm probably in the best position to handle this, although Heidi, by virtue of her role as Canadian Teachers Federation president, would have some background for this too. I was actually chair of the Nova Scotia Teachers Union Bargaining Committee in 2020. That was the first round of bargaining after this legislation was passed. And I would say, you know, teacher collective bargaining typically doesn't really overlap with sort of vocal advocacy by school board trustees. I can't speak for other provinces, but there hasn't been a strong background of that in Nova Scotia. I think sometimes where elected trustees at times can be aligned and support teacher unions in their efforts of collective bargaining. I guess the one thing I would flag, more and more teacher unions are bargaining. People think about collective bargaining, it's all about the money, it's all about wages. But increasingly, teachers are seeking language, and I know Heidi can speak to this in Quebec as well. Teachers are using their bargaining power to bargain for language that entrench resources for classrooms in the collective agreement for teachers that kind of hold governments to account. The governments can't play political yo-yo with education funding. Well, we're going to put a whole bunch in, and then we're going to take a whole bunch out later on. Teachers are seeking to win language in collective agreements that relate to class size, class complexity. So for people that are here from the inclusive education community, supporting students with complex needs as parents or caregivers, teachers are championing language and collective bargaining. They're not only fighting for their salaries, they're also fighting to make sure that they have the resources in the classroom that students need to thrive. And I think having elected trustees who are not gagged like they are in Francophone service centers in Quebec. Oddly enough, in Nova Scotia, they're not called school boards for English schools. They're called regional centers for education, which is really personable and humane. But you have, when you have trustees that can speak free, that can, even from a first voice perspective, say, I support teachers to fight for language that sees inclusive education, supports entrenched in a collective agreement. I'm sick and tired of seeing governments take money away, give money back like it's candy. This is stuff the kids need, and it's time for that to be stable. And I support teachers' efforts. So right now, elected trustees have that capacity. Do they always exercise it? No, but there can be compelling moments where their voices lend credence to what teachers are fighting for in collective bargaining. So it didn't really change the process structurally, and it didn't really alter or sort of diminish voices in Nova Scotia. But I would say for provinces where, if we go all the way out to BC, where they have some of the best language in Canada about classroom conditions, and that language was won in local bargaining as opposed to central provincial bargaining, local trustees can be important allies in teachers winning resources in collective bargaining that are of tremendous and imperative benefit for kids, and particularly for the kids that school systems tend to leave behind the most often.
Yeah, I'm going to just repeat a little bit what he said. Locally, if there is local bargaining, trustees or commissioners that we have in Quebec could be very helpful. As a local president, I have a relationship with the trustees in my community, and so they can be really helpful if I needed some help fighting for something for the conditions of work, for sure.
Just got a great question from Riley on a topic that we haven't touched on a lot in this chat so far, about how would be the best way to handle violence in classrooms without adding police to schools. Because that's one of the parts of Bill 33 that is also quite scary, that we want to introduce police back into schooling. What are some alternatives that we could be putting forth there?
Well, I know that Heidi probably has something she wants to say too, but let me jump in as the Shadow Minister for Education, because my colleague who's the Shadow Minister for Labor and I actually met with teachers and education workers and had extensive conversations about what they see as the solutions to violence in the classroom. And it was very clear that what we need is solutions that will prevent violence from occurring in the first place, not policing children after violence has happened because kids are frustrated by the lack of supports and resources. Because the violence crisis that we're seeing in our schools is the result of the funding cuts. It's the result of fewer caring adults. It's the result of the lack of mental health supports and the cuts to special education, the larger class sizes where not every child's needs are met. And so we solve that violence crisis by surrounding our kids with caring adults who are meeting their needs, who are providing the supports that they need. And yes, there are things that we can do, like ensure that those teachers and education workers have the training that they need to deal with each child. But we do not want to punish our children for failing if they are failing because we failed them. This is about supporting our kids, not policing them.
Well, that was perfect, Chandra, what you just said. It's really about underfunding. That's the key. I would also say that food programs are really important as well. There's been a lot of studies showing that food programs does decrease violence. And then the other thing is our classrooms are a reflection of society, and society is very divided right now and very angry. So unfortunately, our classrooms are a reflection of that. But absolutely, fund, get more resources for kids, have people available to help kids that are struggling.
I hope I can just echo exactly what Heidi said with respect to funding for food programming. One of the things that our NDP government in Manitoba has done is introduce Canada's first ever universal nutrition program. And boy, has that ever made an impact in terms of making sure that kids are coming to school so they can learn, because kids can't learn on an empty stomach. And sometimes kids aren't fed at home, depending on where they may be coming from. So that makes a huge difference. And it's the difference that an NDP government can make as well.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. And the only piece I would add is it's not that, police have no business at school. There are moments when, police need to be on site, not to come down so heavy, but, school shootings. We tend to think about that as a problem, endemic south of the border. But we've had live weapons arrive at a number of schools here locally in Nova Scotia. We had two staff were stabbed and they were in critical condition. I was a hallway away when that happened. It's not that police never come to school, but I think we're having a larger conversation in society about whether police are the right kind of response to people in crisis. Should you send armed, people in flak gear to do a wellness check on somebody that's in a mental health crisis? Is that the right trained person with the right tools to respond? And I think understanding that kids are not adults and that we need to, maybe we need to train sort of a subset of people to deal with kids in crisis when they're behavioral, to learn to see that behavior is a call for help, or it's saying something about what kids need rather than criminalizing that behavior. This is integrated, or it intersects with a larger conversation about policing in society that I think is really, really charged right now. And I think it's a shame, because I think we're in kind of this moment where if we had the courage to really lean into that conversation, I think police would shine in the work that they do. They would be unburdened in their work, be able to be effective within the scope of what they're actually equipped to do. And we can train other people to better respond in a more humane and compassionate way, and decriminalize things and better support people. So that's the only other thing I would add to the points rightfully raised by other folks.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to pull two questions out of the chat that I can answer myself, not to pull focus too hard. But one was from someone who was chatting under the initial F. They asked about what we're doing around the post-secondary aspect of Bill 33, which is also very important. Notably, this conversation has been focused on school board trustees, but we are doing a lot on the post-secondary aspect of Bill 33. All those resources that are on the Ontario NDP website, there are also corresponding resources for the post-secondary aspects of Bill 33, the way that it threatens to defund student services, things like student food banks, sexual assault resource centers, like important student services that campuses run based on student fees might be defunded by Bill 33. We are acting on that. Our youth wing, the Ontario New Democratic Youth, picked up about 20,000 flyers at our convention and brought them to all the campuses across Ontario, and they're doing flyering blitzes. We're connecting with other student groups, the Canadian Federation of Students, and we're organizing students on campuses to fight back against Bill 33 as well. So this is not just a school board issue, it's also a campus issue for colleges and universities. So thank you for bringing that up. It's very important. And then another question that was in the chat was from Ashley, who said that she wants to get involved in fighting against Bill 33, but she lives in a conservative riding and she's intimidated to do this by herself. Any advice on how to approach this? I just responded to you by text, but please contact us at organize@ontariondp.ca by email. We will connect you with some folks on the ground. I know that in blue ridings, it can feel lonely, like there aren't any New Democrats around you, but there always are. And there's people in every riding across Ontario who have the resources and the people power and the flyers and the paper petitions to go door to door and make some noise about this. Because as Evan was saying, school board issues really cuts across the political spectrum. When we were doing door knocking in Ottawa and in Toronto and in the 905, the reaction from people who were not NDP supporters when they hear what the Bill 33 plan is was so positive, so much outrage at Doug Ford. So even in blue ridings, and especially in blue ridings, we need to be loud about this. So please contact us by email, Ashley. We will connect you with people on the ground, and someone will canvass with you. Absolutely. Okay. Any other questions, perhaps just before the end? Anthony Wong asked if there's one talking point, if you have like an elevator pitch, you have 30 seconds with someone to tell them why Bill 33 is bad. Does someone have a really good one-liner?
Maybe I'll start because I actually have been giving 30-second pitches out door knocking and flyering at schools in Ottawa. And if you're flyering at a school, you usually have about 20 seconds as the parent walks past with their child. But I found that's all you need. You just explain that the bill attacks the rights of parents and communities to have a say in our local schools, giving the power over all of the decisions that affect our children and affect our schools to somebody who is appointed by the Minister of Education in downtown Toronto who is not accountable and does not have to respond to us. But maybe, Evan, you have something that worked well in Manitoba too.
I would always say, who would you rather have making the decisions around your local community schools? Fellow people who live in your community or a bureaucrat on Broadway? You could probably use the same thing there, except replace Broadway with Queen's Park. And I know for sure in my community, it's the folks in our community who know best because they're the ones who are going to the school.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. We had one question that was up in the chat earlier from Andrew about Indigenous education and Indigenous language and inclusion in education, how Bill 33 might harm that, and how we can ensure that Indigenous education and culture and languages and knowledge systems are included in our curriculum, in our teacher education, and in school governance across Ontario.
So I think there are several impacts on Indigenous education and Indigenous reconciliation. And one of the components is what Paul talked about, which is that you lose any input at the local level into decisions around reconciliation, into decisions around programs that are offered. So it would be solely the Minister of Education and his handpicked supervisors who would be able to make the decisions about what does reconciliation look like in this particular community? How do we respond to the needs of the local Indigenous community and local Indigenous students, but how also do we make curriculum for settler students reflect the local context and the local Indigenous community? We would lose all that power. We would lose the power to influence decisions about what supports are being provided for Indigenous students. And as Paul said as well, it's often students who are the most vulnerable and most marginalized who depend the most on having a trustee as a local advocate for them. And so those students, those families, their communities would lose that advocacy. They would be at the mercy of whatever the Minister of Education, whoever that might happen to be in downtown Toronto, would decide would be available and accessible to them.
All right, thank you, Chandra. We are now 1 minute from 8. So if there's any other closing words and any of our speakers want to share, a rallying cheer or something to boost our courage in this coming fight, we'd appreciate it. Otherwise, we'll close off.
Jesse, your mic's not working again.
No, me. Okay.
Oh, we can hear you. Yep.
Okay, sorry. Just a small thing from a parent perspective. We're conditioned to see, our fellow neighbors as what party they vote for provincially or federally. And I think someone brought this up earlier. But a lot of these issues, and especially ones around school, if you actually talk to people who would maybe be traditionally conservative, you find that a lot of their ideas on the ground are not that different from yours. And if you get rid of some of the social aspect and you get down to the nitty-gritty kind of economics of it, people are mostly on our side. And you have to approach your fellow citizens in that way without seeing them as conservatives, but seeing them as people with kids in schools, because they want what you want and you want them on your side. So I think that I've been putting that into practice, and it's really wonderful to see the response from people who you would think are just hardcore, trucker conservatives also are like, yeah, man, I think mostly the same things as you. Thanks for talking to me with respect.
Thank you, Jesse. I think that's a really important reminder as we close to remember the humanity of our kids, of our parents and communities, of our workers, and that what we all want is the best for our kids and the best for our communities. And the best is able to happen when we're able to have conversations together as a community. And that's why local decision making and local accountability is so very important. And I want to thank all of our speakers for laying out those stakes and helping us to understand the context, the future that we may be facing here in Ontario if Bill 33 is allowed to pass, but also the opportunity that we do have to have these conversations to fight back. And fighting off Bill 33 is really only step one. Step two is fighting to build the properly funded education system that we need that meets the needs of every child. But when we have those conversations, when we can come together in support of our children, then we have the community power that we need to build that system. So thank you to all of you for being here and sharing your perspectives. And I know that there are some of you who want to get involved, but you're not sure where to start, particularly as an individual. As Amadeus said, you can reach out to organize at ontario.ndp.ca, and we will connect you with local activists on the ground. But I also encourage you to reach out to the teacher and education worker unions who are in your area. The Elementary Teachers Federation, the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation, the English Catholic Teachers Association, and the Association des enseignants et enseignantes francophones, and the Ontario School Board Council of Unions, because all 5 of those unions are opposing Bill 33 and are encouraging their members to get engaged on the ground fighting back against this attack on education. Your local Labour Council is likely involved. You can reach out to school board trustees in your area who are progressive and who fight for children regularly. And then parent councils are also frequently a source of advocacy and support of our kids. So you may learn more about work that is already happening in your community, or maybe your outreach will be the spark that gets organizing going in your community. But please reach out, know that you're not alone, have all of those conversations, and know that we'll be organizing alongside you, because it's that solidarity that is going to lead to victory here in Ontario and lead to a school system that respects local voices and supports our kids. So thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight.
Thank you, everyone. And please keep an eye on our emails. We're going to be sending around all those resources and links to everyone who RSVP'd. But thank you all for coming. Have a good evening, everyone, and take care.